All right. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started as folks are coming in, getting comfortable. It is St. Patrick's Day, so happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone. We really appreciate that. Whether you are Irish all the time like myself or just today, welcome. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. So good morning, obviously, and welcome to our March NOAC Chamber Focus Series event. We're really excited to have you here. My name is Cindy Holzheimer. I'm the president and CEO of the Northern Ohio Area Chambers of Commerce. I do want to give a shout out to your peers, if you will, and that is the executive team here at NOAC. So as I call your name, if you're in the room today, just give us a quick wave. We have Karen Schaefer. She is the NOAC Program Director. Missy McWhorter, NOAC Board Chair. She's also the Executive Director of the Fairlawn Area Chamber. John Soboleski is the immediate past chair. He is the executive director of the Powers of More. I know he is at the St. Patrick's Day Parade. I talked to him a little bit ago. Karen Tursick is the NOAC vice chair. She is also the executive director of the Willoughby Western Lake County Chamber. Mr. Tom Bennett is the NOAC treasurer. He is also the president, CEO of the Solon Chamber. Mr. Greg Church, he is the NOAC secretary. He's also the director of the Greater Ashtabula Chamber. Lori Reinbold is the NOAC at-large position. She's the president, CEO of the Orville Area Chamber. And Rachel Wincoop, NOAC at-large. She is the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce of Sandusky County. So big mouthful, but welcome to them. So I'm so excited for today's speaker that I'm going to reserve all of our announcements until the end of the presentation today so that we can jump right in. And to introduce our speaker today, I do want to welcome Rachel Wincoop.
Good morning, everyone. I am so excited to be able to introduce Cathi. Cathi Hight is a Kaizen consultant and president of Hight Performance Group, considered as the membership guru and the developer of the member retention kits and a new approach to tiered membership. Cathi helps associations meet the expectations of their members. Cathi was a national trainer for ACCE and has been an instructor for IOM since 2004. Cathi has a diverse career, which includes VP of Operations for the Chamber of Commerce of Hawaii, Senior Vice of Investor Relations and Growth Strategy for the Greater Austin Chamber, Regional Sales and Marketing Manager for Dole Foods and Dean Foods, National Manager for the Kauffman Foundation's Fast Track Entrepreneurship Program, and a Motorola University instructor. Cathi guides associations of all sizes to develop strategies to manage change, build resilience, and evolve their organizations for long-term sustainability. So thank you very much for joining us, Cathi.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We have a really great audience here today. So I'm excited about that. You're from all over. And I've been to Ohio many times. I love it. And I think the people there are just super friendly. And I'm really happy to be able to have you here today. I know we're going to have another one scheduled later on this year. But for this topic, what we wanted to talk about was a board development. And I understand that some of you have your board members in attendance, and I think that's great. And I would also appreciate, I think, having some of the board members maybe be able to comment on how we can certainly increase the engagement of more of our directors on our chamber board. So feel free to weigh in. We certainly appreciate you being here today and want to learn from you as well. And for anyone else that wants to share what's working for them, or you have a question or something that you want to ask about the content, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'll look for those questions and comments, hopefully try to get to everyone who does make a comment. And if not, towards the top of the next hour, we'll certainly take a time to stop and to answer any questions that have not been answered as of yet. So thanks for being here, and I really appreciate that you are here. All right, everybody can see the slide okay? Is that, you know what? I realize I've got PDF on version. Hang on a second. Let me just bring up the actual PowerPoint, because that's what I want. So bear with me for just a second while I do that. And be easier for me to move the slides if it's in PowerPoint mode, obviously. So apologize about that. All right, so our topic is time, talent, and treasure. And those are really the different types of engagement that we can see from our directors. We'll talk a little bit about each of these. I mean, obviously, it's great if we could get all three from directors, but I think it also helps us to realize that all three of these types of engagement are valued. And so you might only see one or two from each of your directors. But we certainly want to thank all of our directors for being involved. Thanks for the great introduction, Rachel. I really appreciate that. So I feel like I'm on the opposite coast, having been in Honolulu just a couple of weeks ago and now over here on the East Coast. Some questions, and I saw those up on the slide earlier too, but certainly some things to kind of help you get started as we think about this topic. So thinking about the engagement of your board members and how you might rate that. I know that we hear from across the country that, especially I think during COVID, it was sometimes difficult. Are you able to see the slides or not see the slides?
No, we are not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for letting me know.
I was just
Let me go
waiting for
ahead
a
and
time where I could jump in and let you know.
interject. Okay. All right.
Better.
Can you see the slide now?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So just some questions to think about. How would you rate the engagement of board members? What you consider to really help to influence directors to be engaged, and certainly how do we define engagement? And that comes up all the time, especially as we're trying to measure board engagement and people want to know, how do you measure engagement? And so those are some things we'll talk about as well. So in this webinar, we're going to certainly focus on how to define engagement and communicate those expectations for serving on the board. We're going to recognize the three assets of engagement from your directors, which is time, talent, and treasure. And then I'm going to walk through 7 rules of engagement and how you could improve the board's overall engagement. So let's start first with engagement, just a generic definition. What do we mean by engagement? And I like this one that comes from Charles Tahanu. So when you think about engagement, right, really being between the organization and the individual, really measured by the investment that individuals make, especially when we talk about directors to strengthen the organization, to ensure that it has long-term viability, and also to increase positive sentiment about the organization to the community and progressively increase the future investment for the organization. So that's a great way, I think, of describing what it is that we're hoping for through our board engagement. So we'll get in and talk about the 3 assets of engagement. Each of these, like I said, is of value, but not all of our directors can do all 3 of these. And so that first type of investment obviously is time, right? So coming to board meetings is an investment of all of the directors' time. Asking them to chair a committee or to serve on a committee. Taking time to respond to calls for action when we do advocacy, that takes time, right, out of their day or their time. I know there's also an expectation that directors would attend events and would help represent the organization at meetings that are out in the community, meetings with policymakers, and also to help with public relations in the community, especially when you're a small chamber. It's hard for that small staff or the CEO to really be everywhere. So we know that asking for their time is certainly important, and any other type of volunteer activities. Not all board members are able to afford a lot of their time, and I know we do have that expectation. But again, we'll talk about managing those expectations, and when we get into the seven strategies. But certainly, at least on the minimum, we would like to see directors at board meetings and chairing a committee or serving on a committee, especially if it's a committee of interest to them, would be great. Now, one thing that we know when we talk about engagement of membership and different levels of engagement, coming to events is certainly valued by all of our members, But we know that asking them for additional time is a precious commodity, I think, for all of us. We all have a limited amount of time to be able to serve. And so asking them to come to board meetings certainly is expected. Being on a committee, giving of oneself to help to drive that organization forward is actually considered the highest form of engagement that any member can make with your organization, is to give of their time. So we appreciate those directors that are able to do that. It's not the only way that you can have engagement. And I think that's important for us to realize, because I think most of the time what we're asking for is time. But engagement is also and a very another asset around engagement is talent. I mean, if you think about it, you really recruit directors for a lot of different reasons. And part of that is their skills and their knowledge and their experience, whether it's in finance or marketing or digital presence or advocacy. Our directors have so much talent. And I think that's the thing that I hear often from directors, is that sometimes they don't feel that their talent is really being utilized. So just to recognize that that is really important, to really allow them to bring to the table what they have as a strength. And sometimes it goes beyond just what company they're with and their title, but to recognize that they also come with a lot of skills and knowledge and background that can be really helpful. They can also share their talent by nominating and recruiting potential board members just through their contacts. It could be other people at their organization, other people that they have relationships with. So we think about talent and relationships, those two things go together. They can also, provide that testimonial to be able to endorse some of the initiatives that the chamber is doing. Leveraging their name, their company is an asset of theirs. And so that can certainly be leveraged, and that should be considered as engagement as well. Connecting people through who they know is really important. And sometimes your directors might have access to different segments of the population, industry in your city. They certainly have relationships with lots of different people. So leveraging those relationships and making the connections, opening the doors for you in a number of different ways is certainly also a great way that you can access their talent. The thing that I hear often, and I've done benchmarking on behalf of chambers that are looking for board engagement. And so we oftentimes will talk to other chambers that have really high engagement, but more importantly, also talking to those directors to find out what makes them want to be more engaged with the chamber. And one of the things that comes up often is, aligning what they're interested in to a particular initiative. So maybe they don't want to serve on all committees, or they don't want to support everything with the time and the assets they have. But the more that you can align that to something that they're really passionate about, whether it's education or young professionals or advocacy, oftentimes they will support more of those interests if there's a personal alignment or a corporate alignment to what that initiative is. They can also help to mentor some emerging leaders. One thing that we do know is that the workforce is comprised today, 75% of it is millennials, followed by Gen Zs. And those two generations will actually dominate the workforce by 2030. And folks like me, I'm a boomer, we're only going to represent 10% of the workforce in just few years. So there's definitely the opportunity for mentorship to help these emerging leaders take the helm in their departments and of the company and running businesses. And certainly our directors can certainly be helpful. The Cincinnati Chamber, by the way, has a great program, and it's called Cincy Chat. And it really connects CEOs of current companies that are of, like a Gen X or a boomer generation, really then having chats with young professionals and giving them the opportunity to really, for the CEOs to be able to listen to the young professionals, but also really to help kind of influence what the future of the community is going to look like. And not really so much serving in a one-on-one mentorship role, but more in a group type of format to share best practices, to learn about industry, just the lay of the land. And one of the things that I think is really important is there is sort of a diplomacy, kind of a way that you get people on your side in the company. Um, there's a great book called How to Get Them on Your Side, and another book called How to Keep Them on Your Side. And I want to say the author is Samuel Bacharach. It's a great management book. But one of the things they talk about is sometimes how difficult it is to get your ideas and opinions and projects advanced in a company. And part of that is really sort of understanding how to get people to want to do what you want them to do. And I think CEOs can certainly provide a whole lot of support in encouraging young people, but also explaining to them what works in a corporate culture and how do you make that happen, or how do you manage employees and what motivates them. And I think there could be some good sharing either way. It's also possible to really kind of think about, just using talent, getting people onto committees. So if the chamber director themselves cannot necessarily provide that time, but there are other people in their company who might be able to serve on a committee, they can certainly leverage the talent of their organizations to be more involved as well. So Rachel, I like it. Mentor Mondays. Yeah, definitely a great way to connect the generations. And I think before, the boomers who are exiting the workforce every day, taking really advantage of that ability to bring those generations together, I think could be a great way of doing that. So applaud the Cincinnati Chamber for recognizing that as a way to kind of bring their young professionals in with the CEOs and having that type of exchange. So Rachel, I'm glad to hear that you're doing that as well. The third type of engagement asset is treasure. And so when we think about that, that's money, right? And so asking our directors and their companies where they can to support, efforts that we have around campaigns. It could be a capital campaign. It could be an economic development campaign, a cause or initiative the chamber is supporting. And that's why sometimes, when we put together something like, for instance, at the Austin Chamber, we did a board referral campaign, and there were several directors that said, well, is it a give, or can it be is it a give or a get, right? In other words, if the expectation is to bring in $3,000 in new member revenue, can I just write the check? Because there are some board members that feel that they don't have the time to invest in that type of initiative, but they would rather just write a check as a contribution to that effort, but not necessarily put in the time. So when you think about donations, there are lots of companies that will provide donations, whether it's food or materials or other types of things that the chamber needs for silent auctions. That's definitely an engagement asset as well. Sponsorships, of course, is another type of way of investing treasure into the chamber, but also providing pro bono services, right? So things that the chamber would normally pay for, but a director is willing to do in kind, can certainly count as engagement as well. And then any other types of revenue efforts that the chamber is trying to undertake. So I hope that you realize that there are really different ways for your directors to be engaged. And time, although it's of value, is not the only way that they can support the chamber. So it'd be interesting to have some of the board members also be able to weigh in, give us some thoughts about that, and whether or not that you think that that's a good way of sort of looking at director engagement and not necessarily thinking that it's just time, although we certainly value the time because we know, like I said, how precious that is. So we're going to get into 7 rules of engagement, things that would actually help drive engagement from your directors. And hopefully you're doing a number of these things. And you might look for an opportunity about where you might be able to improve on your engagement. So the first one certainly is to define engagement expectations. So if you do have engagements of your directors, then you want to make sure that that's spelled out. And the first way that you can do that is by having a director application. It'd be interesting to see how many of you actually have a description of the role for being on the chamber board, but also an application, something that you put out there so that members who are interested or who are nominated or want to self-nominate can actually fill out an application. But having a job description is really important. Spell out what those expectations are. If you have attendance expectations or around engaging on a committee, if there is a give or get. I remember, it was been years ago, but I remember when I was asked to serve on the local YWCA board, and right on the job description, it said there was a $10,000 give or get commitment to the Y. Not every organization has that type of expectation on there, but if there is one, then you definitely want to make sure that it's spelled out. And I know in the board referral campaign, they were thinking about whether or not they were going to change their board description, that every director coming on board would have that expectation for bringing in $3,000 for new chamber membership revenue. I don't know if they were actually going to do that, but it did come up. It was very successful, and it kind of replaced the 3-day crazy campaign that I know a lot of chambers do. But because this board referral campaign was a year long, so it didn't have to happen in a short period of time, and that's where they wanted to go instead. But any expectation that you have should be spelled out, because if someone is going to serve on your board, they should know what the expectation is. It's no different than if you hire an employee and you have expectations for that role. Sharing with them the job description is important. People want to know what it is that they're signing up for, and I think people are more likely to deliver on those expectations if they know what they are clearly up front. The other thing I like is having the application, especially asking why they're interested in serving on the board, what it is that they would bring to the table, how they think they could benefit the board of directors. I think having something like that certainly is important as well. I know several organizations where I have been on the board that has been a good process to really understand, especially if you're kind of looking at different types of people that you're trying to recruit to the board, understanding what they hope to do or the knowledge or expertise they have. And sometimes it's something that you may not be aware of that certainly is important for the nominating committee to consider. And then when they do sign up to be on the board, having some type of agreement that they sign, oftentimes that usually is the job description, but having them sign it and date it is important. And that might even be something that you consider revisiting every year so that everyone has a reminder of what the commitments are to serve on the board of directors. The second rule for engagement is to onboard all new directors for that leadership journey. Having a new director orientation, which could be done one-on-one if you only have a couple of people that are coming onto your board. If you have more than that, I know sometimes depending on your bylaws, you might have a third of your board have their terms end and then new board members taking their place. But taking the time to do the orientation is really important. And when I talk to different directors, those that have had a great experience with orientation and those that haven't, they said it really makes a big difference for them to really go through and prepare a board manual and have an overview of the organization and make sure that you include the mission and vision statement, a copy of the bylaws, a copy of your strategic plan, and any policies that are in place at the board has voted on and are active right now. Sometimes we choose to have policy to really help address some operational types of issues rather than change the bylaws, but make sure that those are available to your new board members. Going over and talking about the board roles and responsibilities, Also discussing conflict of interest, non-disclosures, those types of things should also be handled during orientation. And having a board mentor, someone who has been on the board already, who can kind of be someone who can help mentor that new person maybe for the first 90 days is certainly helpful. One of the things that some of the directors at other chambers have mentioned is, you know, if they're fairly new to the organization, to the board, don't have the relationships with the other folks on the board, they feel more comfortable having introductions with other people on the board, getting to know them, and feeling that this is a safe place for them to be able to discuss openly issues, but also, you know, building that sense of rapport and trust is important. Your third rule for engagement is to really create a good partnership for success between the CEO and the board chair. And those of you that have been in the business for a while certainly know how important that is. The board chair really is going to have that, needs to have that strong relationship with the director or the president, but that person also is going to help manage the directors overall. And so there needs to kind of be that sort of line of delineation between the executive director and the CEO and the board chair. Having frequent conversations, candid communication, just a great relationship between those two is critical for not just the success of the organization, but for a great year on the board. I also think that the behaviors of the board chair and the communication that the board chair has with the rest of the directors really sets the tone for the other directors on the board. It also sets the stage for how the board is going to be governed and the expectations for engagement. So I think it's important to choose your chair carefully, but also make sure that you have some of that building prior to them taking the helm to really talk about that. We know that every chair oftentimes has kind of a stronger area of interest. Sometimes it is advocacy, sometimes it's membership, sometimes it's different, but really understanding what it is that they would really like to spend a little bit more time on. Obviously, every chair should make sure that the strategic plan is successful, but usually you'll find that they do have a special area of emphasis. And so having a chance to talk about that is important. Any expectations in terms of board engagement, the direction of the board, what the focus is, usually will come from the chair. So I think that's important. And I would expect that every chair would kind of model the expectations. But I've heard from some chambers where sometimes the person who is not engaged and not really modeling the way is the chair. The chair not being able to be at meetings, or not really engaging, or sometimes being missing in action, it can really sometimes, create sort of a kind of a morale drop, I think, amongst the rest of the board, because that is their leader of the board. And so I think that's really important. And who should be holding other directors accountable to engagement? It should be the chair of the board. And I know oftentimes that falls on the CEO or the executive director, but I think having that strong relationship and recognizing the role of the chair as the leader of the board, I think is really, really important. Another type of rule for engagement, which is a little bit different, is to conduct an annual board effectiveness survey every year. And you'll get the slides. And if you're like me and you have a touch screen or the ability to increase the font, the view, you can take a look at these questions. Feel free to change any of the questions. But I think it's important to really ask the board overall how effective the board is in honoring or really employing its governance responsibilities, making sure that there are financial checks and balances, that there is an audit that is performed, that meetings are well attended, that there is engagement on the board, that there's enough time on the meetings, in the meetings, to really address the things that need to be done. Whatever you choose to put on there, I wouldn't make it very long, but to really just kind of ask them, and you can think about sort of enablers for engagement and whether or not those things are there. It's nice if that is anonymous, in the sense that we don't share the how each board member rated the board overall, but you kind of look at things on an aggregate basis and report that back to the board in terms of what do they rate themselves high on, and what are perhaps some areas for improvement, and to be able to discuss that. The other thing that you can also include in that survey is a self-assessment as a director, right? So what is it that I enjoy most about serving on the board, or why I am serving on the board, and really just, making sure that they feel that they have the opportunity to rate themselves in terms of how they're serving the board. And again, you can change those questions. Sometimes that's the awareness that's needed, but I think also to provide some feedback to the board in terms of where the ratings are the highest and where they're the lowest, and then to have a discussion around how we could improve the engagement and the governance on the board. I don't know if you want to take it this far, but you could create a board engagement scorecard. And I've worked with a few chambers on doing this. And sometimes, there is a sense of uncomfortableness. I'd like to see some of the board members maybe that are on the webinar with us, maybe to give their thoughts, but to have some type of scorecard. Now, of course, you would have to agree as a board what is on this scorecard, right? Attendance. I mean, I know we track attendance because we have to put it into our meeting minutes, but do we want to actually have some way of on the board to know which board members, have 75 to 100% of meeting attendance and those that don't? Do we want to have support generation, maybe a committee? The board survey, yes, it is submitted anonymously. Thanks for the question. I appreciate that. But I think having an agreement on what should be on here so that every board member is in agreement. So I'm not saying it needs to be all of these things. It's just a sample. And I remember a lively discussion with a board who was entertaining doing this. And there were some board members that were not comfortable with it. Other ones were. And I think what I heard kind of as a sidebar was that the board members who felt that they were really delivering on their engagement, their service to the chamber, didn't have a problem with it. That probably sometimes the ones who are not excited about having a scorecard like that that's visible to all of their peer directors are the ones who probably would not like to see how they fare with their other directors. Yeah, Kathy, I like that suggestion. This might be something that's done and really is done between the CEO or president and the chair really sort of looking at that as a way to kind of know what the engagement level is for each director, and then reaching out, like you said, one-on-one to the directors who perhaps don't really have a really high engagement score. And sometimes you need to find out. I know of some directors on boards that were not able to engage fully because they had something going on with their family or their health or their job. I knew of one director that was a legal counsel for their company, and they were going through a merger, and it was just taking a lot of time for her. So, sometimes there are extenuating circumstances that are going on. So I think it's important. And if there is something going on, to really be able to accommodate that board member, or to really look, like you said, at how else they can be engaged if it's not, for the time, or whether or not this isn't even a good time for them to serve, right? So those are all things that can come about. The fifth rule for engagement, which we talked about a little bit earlier, is that of those that aren't able to give time, or what it is that would drive their engagement. And when I've talked to different directors, just one-on-one, about what would really increase their engagement, these are some things that really come from them. They said, for us, it's, sort of feeling that this is a two-way street. Obviously, they are serving on your board of director, on your board, but they oftentimes come with sort of an intent, whether they're growing themselves professionally, they have a passion, particular area. And sometimes you find that you have directors that have a great passion for a particular area or initiative, but don't necessarily want to be on the board. For instance, I was talking to one chamber CEO, and he said, when I first got here, we had 70 on our board, and it was really huge, and it was difficult to manage, and we really didn't have the engagement that we needed on the board, and yet we had so many people. And he said, so what I did was I just talked one-on-one with every director. And what I found out was that half of them were really interested in a particular area of the chamber and would be happy to just serve on a committee, perhaps even chair the committee, but they weren't interested as much as being on the board itself. And he said, so I gave them an opportunity to decide that they didn't want to be on the board, but they would instead provide support to the chamber through a committee. And he said, and that's how we got our board to shrink half in size. But the engagement of our board went up tremendously when we were able to make that distinction between, were they interested in really being on the board and in everything that we're doing, or if they had a particular interest instead. So I think aligning their passion of interest to the opportunities that the chamber offers is certainly important. And I think you can ask questions, the questions you see at the bottom of the screen, right? Does what the chamber focus on, does that really motivate them, right? Maybe these are great questions to ask on your application to really kind of find out what it is that they want to do or why they want to be on the board. And are these really going to be board members who are going to engage with you the way that you want, but also the way that they want? And if you understand what's important to them, you can tap them for opportunities that really align to their interests. And I think that's where you'll see more of them say yes. The sixth rule for engagement is to really think about recruiting directors for engagement. The other thing you can also kind of look at this board matrix worksheet as being is it's a board composition and competency matrix. So that you really understand what is it that you're looking for on your board of directors in terms of skills and expertise, the kinds of resources that their organization may have, their connection to the community, what segment are they representing, or where are they strong in terms of having those connections, but also think about their personal style, right? And what it is that maybe you're hoping to gain by having them on the board. You can certainly look at other kinds of demographics. And then that little piece that's in the middle is just a different list from another organization. But just to give you an idea of the types of things that you could put in your worksheet, and then you can kind of plot your current board members and how much of this really aligns with who you currently have on the board. Look to see where the gaps are on your board, and that may help you as you're looking for new directors and thinking about the gaps and the attributes and skills and expertise that you're really looking to have on your board. So this would be kind of a more strategic way, I think, of looking at your board of directors and thinking about how you can start to shape your board of directors, maybe to be the type of board that you're really hoping to have over the next 3 to 5 years, especially as you look at your strategic plan. And if there are some areas of focus where it'd be great to have board leadership, you can start to recruit board members to actually align with that. And that gets me to the seventh. rules for engagement. And what I would encourage you to do is to rethink the nominating committee. And I know it's spelled out in your bylaws, so think carefully before you decide that you want to change that. I think a newer trend that we're starting to see, and of course, not the majority of chambers across the board, but this idea about having a board governance committee or a board development committee. And what this committee would do, they would still help recruit, right, and run the whole nomination process. But this would be a committee that would meet throughout the year. They wouldn't meet just in time for those coming up with who the new directors would be. Chairing this perhaps by your incoming chair or another director who you think is very effective, but also respected by the rest of the board. This could be the committee that actually handles the board performance survey, that effectiveness survey feedback, might actually keep track of board engagement, but could also really kind of manage that board competency and composition board matrix to really start to kind of prepare how the board makeup needs to change perhaps over the next few years as we kind of start to design maybe the ideal board the chamber needs to have. They could also handle the orientation, serve as those board mentors for those new directors that you have, but they can also help with I'm trying to move the bar that's down below so I can read that last line. I'll just have to read it off my slides. But at the same time, having meetings that are really engaging, these folks could actually help to sort of create ideas, maybe think about board education, could even help to create the board retreat that you might do once a year. I think it would be a huge help for the CEOs and executive directors. I'd like to see you weigh in on that. The idea of having a committee that really is around board development in general, who takes on a larger role, operates throughout the year, still handles nominating, but does a lot more. And I think that would be a huge help, I think, in driving board engagement going forward. All right. And I do have one additional thing that I'm going to add to this list after we finish reviewing, right? So the 7 rules for engagement, expectations, defining them early and communicating those expectations, having an onboarding orientation process for all new directors, having that great relationship between the CEO and the chair, being partners for the success of the board, and then evaluating board effectiveness and engagement, aligning with directors' interests and passions, so learning more about what they're really excited about within the strategic plan, what it is that they're hoping to get out of being a leader at the chamber. How does that align with both their company, but as well as for themselves on a professional development? Recruiting for engagement as you kind of think about your board makeup and what you want your board to look like over the next 3 to 5 years, and then rethinking that nominating committee to be more of a board development committee. The last tip that I'll put in there, and that really comes from directors that I've had the opportunity to talk with about what could really drive increased engagement. And a lot of them talked about the meetings. And they said, we should have more effective and certainly more engaging meetings. So having the information that they need well in advance of the meeting, giving them something on a Friday and the meeting is on Monday or Tuesday, kind of sets them up for that expectation that they have to review all of this information to be well informed before they show up, and giving of their personal time to do that. They also like the consent agenda to really just be able to vote on a set number of things like approving of minutes, the budget and other types of things that you might put in a consent agenda so it doesn't take up as much time. They really, several of them talked about dashboards being much more meaningful and effective to them if the board could decide what are the key metrics that they really want to keep their eye on, and seeing a monthly dashboard, especially one that shows trending, and showing them where the chamber is doing really well and where it's not, so that they could then have the idea of what's the operational health of the organization? Where should we be focusing our time? And they prefer that than necessarily, not to say you can't still have reports, but they said, dashboards really make all of us focus on what's most important and to really be able to manage the organizational health. Having something of interest to them in terms of a board education, right? I think sometimes when you're on the board of directors, you're really on the inside, in the inside circle of knowing what's going on in the community. And the things that they have valued about meetings is when there is a speaker who's presenting on some aspect of the committee, whether we have the community, whether it's, what are ideas for this open parcel of land? What is the city considering? Having the city talk about its master plan, having, a particular industry come in and do a presentation with the board. They said that those are the most interesting meetings. If everything that happens in a meeting is something I could read about in the minutes, I know I should show up. And I do, but it's not always an interesting meeting. And so they said, when they have these special things on the agenda, it makes me want to go because I feel like I'm going to miss something if I'm not there. Another thing that they also valued, and in one chamber in particular, they said once a quarter, we have a strategic topic that's on the agenda. It could be something that's in our strategic plan. It could be kind of a glimpse of maybe a future trend or something that we're noticing. And the board is just actively engaged, kind of sharing where they think that's affecting industry, how that shows up in their industry, some ideas of how that might, the chamber might be able to leverage it. And they said, that's great because you're really tapping in to our talent, our knowledge, right? And you have the brightest minds in the entire community. We love to be leveraged and we love to come together, but we don't necessarily like to just sit and listen to reports and just to do votes, but just to be engaged with each other is hugely beneficial. And, having a retreat, again, that's more than just strategic planning, that really has the ability for them to get to know each other. I know of one chamber, I'm not saying you need to do this, but they're about 5 hours from Santa Fe. And so every year their board retreat is at Santa Fe. It's Thursday afternoon and Friday morning, but they come with their families and they all have dinner together Thursday night, but they have families who actually enjoy that time together and also just mingling with other directors and their families. So they said, something that really kind of builds on the relationships, but it's also a treat. Now, they do pay their own way, but they said it's just exciting. And another thing that came up was having opportunities to network before and after the board meeting is also helpful. And with one chamber that I worked with, they actually ended up moving their lunch meeting, which sometimes cuts into their day, and moved it to the end of the day. And what follows is kind of a cocktail reception with the board. And that they said that that was so much better for them. It was a better use of their time, and it also made them more relaxed to be at the meeting. And it really gave them a chance to really be able to get to know each other a little bit better. So let's go ahead and wrap things up. So board engagement is really critical, right? It's to help you develop long-term sustainability for your chamber, recognizing that engagement can be leveraged through time, talent, and treasure, not just time. And the more that we can also help to align our directors' motivations, what matters most to them, what they're passionate about, and what the chamber really provides in terms of programs and opportunities is really going to create a lot more of those partnerships between the chamber and the individual directors. And then obviously cultivating an engaged board requires smart recruiting to your board, effective onboarding, but also really making sure that you can create an environment that invites and sustains engagement. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, entertain any comments that you have, but I'd love to hear from you. I also have my contact information up. I know you're going to get a copy of the slides. But is there anything that resonated with you? Is there an idea or something that you got from today's webinar that you'd love to bring back to your chamber?